The story begins with a kind of silence that feels ordinary at first, the kind that belongs to a summer morning in a small American city. Yet within that silence, something irreversible is already forming, unnoticed by everyone involved. 2. Vulnerable lives are about to disappear from a place that will never fully explain what happened. There are mornings that feel identical to every other morning, where nothing seems out of place and time moves without resistance. But in hindsight, those are often the moments that conceal the beginning of tragedy. On July 25, 2015, in Gary, Indiana, 2 people would vanish in a way that continues to resist explanation. King Walker, a 2-year-old boy, and his Aunt Diamond Bynum, a young woman with cognitive limitations, vanished without leaving any clear trace. The case became a disturbing mystery defined not just by absence but by how completely it erased itself. It raised painful questions about family trust, fragile protection, and whether they simply wandered off or were targeted by someone who saw vulnerability as opportunity. Before diving deeper into the case, it is important to understand that stories like this do not exist in isolation. If you are drawn to real cold cases and unresolved disappearances that challenge logic and perception, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, so you can continue following these investigations that still wait for answers. Gary, Indiana carried 2 identities at the same time. In daylight, it could seem calm and ordinary, but behind that appearance were abandoned homes, collapsing streets, and entire neighborhoods marked by silence. Absence was woven into the city itself. The Bynum family had only recently moved there from Hammond, still trying to adapt to an unfamiliar environment that never fully felt stable or predictable to them during those early months. The morning of July 25, 2015 began with complete normality. Summer light moved through the house while a television played softly in the background. Family members discussed plans for a birthday celebration scheduled for the following day. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested fear, urgency, or danger. It was the type of ordinary morning people rarely remember clearly until tragedy forces every small detail into permanent focus later after everything changes forever unexpectedly. King Walker had been brought to his grandparents' home for childcare, a routine act built entirely on family trust. At 2 years old, King understood little beyond comfort, curiosity, and movement. He was energetic, constantly running and exploring the world around him. Later, his appearance became permanently fixed in public memory. Small dreadlocks, a blue shirt, red pants, and white sneakers worn on the day he disappeared without any explanation afterward. Diamond Bynum lived with a different kind of vulnerability. At 21, she had Prader-Willi syndrome, a condition affecting both cognitive development and impulse control. Her mental understanding resembled that of a young child, requiring supervision and structure in daily life. Despite these limitations, Diamond cared deeply for King and often viewed herself as his protector, emotionally attached to him in ways both affectionate and tragically fragile at the same time. Together, King and Diamond represented 2 forms of vulnerability existing inside the same household. One was too young to recognize danger, while the other lacked the cognitive ability to fully understand it. Around them were adults attempting to preserve routine and stability. Ariana Walker trusted relatives to care for her son while she handled daily responsibilities, never imagining that this ordinary decision would later become a permanent source of grief and unanswered questions. Eugene Bynum Jr., Diamond's father, became one of the most relentless figures in the search that followed. For years, he walked through abandoned buildings, empty lots, and collapsing neighborhoods across Gary, searching for even the smallest sign of his daughter and young grandson. His persistence reflected more than hope. It reflected the refusal to accept that 2 vulnerable people could simply vanish without explanation in broad daylight without witnesses. Suzanne, Diamond's stepmother, was the last known adult to see both King and Diamond before they disappeared. According to her account, King had been placed down for a nap while Diamond rested nearby inside the home. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested danger. The television played softly, the neighborhood remained quiet, and the morning carried the kind of ordinary calm that rarely attracts attention from anyone nearby at all. Around 10:20 that morning, Suzanne reportedly fell asleep in the same room. When she woke less than an hour later, both King and Diamond were gone. The house showed no signs of forced entry, disturbance, or panic. There were no overturned objects, no cries heard by neighbors, and no visible indication of how two vulnerable people had left the property unnoticed during the middle of a summer morning entirely. The emptiness itself became the first terrifying mystery. Investigators found nothing inside the home suggesting violence or sudden fear. Instead, the environment appeared strangely untouched, as though King and Diamond had simply dissolved from the scene without resistance. Residents later admitted Diamond had occasionally wandered nearby streets searching for food, but she rarely moved beyond familiar blocks and often appeared confused or uncertain while outside alone without supervision nearby. That detail created a troubling contradiction. If Diamond had walked away alone while guiding a restless 2-year-old child, someone should have noticed them moving slowly through the neighborhood. Yet if she did not leave willingly, investigators were forced to consider the possibility that another person had entered the situation quietly and removed them both within only a matter of minutes without creating attention. Gary itself deepened the uncertainty surrounding the disappearance. By 2015, large sections of the city were filled with abandoned homes, neglected industrial areas, and empty streets hidden between deteriorating neighborhoods. Visibility was limited, witnesses were inconsistent, and unusual activity often blended into the background. In a place shaped by silence and decay, disappearance did not always require force. Sometimes it required only timing and isolation. What continues to haunt investigators is not only that King Walker and Diamond Bynum disappeared, but how completely the disappearance erased itself. No witness ever confirmed seeing them leave. No physical trail ever emerged. No sound interrupted the stillness of that morning. It was as if they had been quietly removed from the world itself. And within that silence, one disturbing possibility slowly began to grow. Someone may have been watching long before they vanished. The disappearance of King Walker and Diamond Bynum does not begin with chaos. It begins with routine, the kind of routine that makes danger almost invisible. In cases like this, the most important details are not dramatic events, but the small gaps in time where everything quietly stops making sense. The morning of July 25, 2015 unfolds with no immediate indication of disruption. King is brought to his grandparents' home as part of normal family care arrangements. There is no tension in the environment, no warning sign that anything unusual is about to occur. Inside the household, preparations continue for a family birthday, scheduled for the following day. Conversations remain ordinary, movements unremarkable, and nothing suggests that the day will deviate from its expected rhythm. In hindsight, this normality becomes psychologically unsettling. According to Suzanne's later account, around 10:20 in the morning, she fell asleep while King and Diamond were inside the home. This moment becomes the central fracture point of the entire timeline. It is not marked by action, but by absence of awareness. During that period, Diamond left behind both her daily medication and the tablet device she normally kept close for comfort and routine. These details became important because they contradicted the idea of a planned departure. Nothing inside the home suggested preparation for leaving. Instead, the scene reflected temporary rest, interrupted suddenly by a disappearance no one could explain afterward. Family members believed Diamond never intended to travel far that morning. Her behavior usually involved short, familiar walks connected to immediate needs, especially food, rather than planned movement or independent travel. Still, alternative theories quickly emerged. Some early reports suggested Diamond and King may have walked together toward a nearby store or fast food restaurant, though these assumptions were based largely on possibility instead of confirmed sightings or verified evidence. One of the earliest problems investigators faced was inconsistency. The timeline did not align with known walking distances, and witness statements varied dramatically. Some people believed they had seen King and Diamond nearby, but none of the reports could be fully verified. Every possible sighting introduced More uncertainty instead of clarity, making the search increasingly difficult to organize with confidence. The case became even more frustrating because there was almost no surveillance evidence available. No security cameras captured them leaving the home, crossing nearby streets, or interacting with anyone outside. There was no visual transition between safety and disappearance. Investigators were left trying to reconstruct movement without footage, direction, or a confirmed point where the two vulnerable individuals entered public space that morning unnoticed. There was also no sound connected to the disappearance. No neighbor reported hearing panic, shouting, or signs of struggle during the critical period. In many investigations, noise becomes the first indication that something abnormal has occurred. Here, even that basic signal was absent. What remained was a strangely quiet image, an unguarded doorway, and two people suddenly no longer inside the home they occupied moments earlier. Investigators quickly focused on another contradiction involving Diamond herself. Because of her physical condition, she moved slowly and often walked with difficulty. Supervising an energetic 2-year-old while traveling any significant distance would have been challenging. If she left on foot with King, their movement should have been visible to someone nearby. Yet if another person was involved, the removal would have required remarkable speed and precision. Both possibilities created investigative problems. A slow departure should have produced witnesses, while a rapid abduction should have produced noise or signs of interruption. Instead, the environment produced neither reaction nor evidence. This lack of response became one of the most psychologically unsettling elements of the case, suggesting that whatever happened occurred within an incredibly narrow window before anyone nearby recognized danger or unusual activity. When Suzanne woke around 11:20 a.m., panic replaced normality almost instantly. She contacted Eugene Bynum before police were notified, while family members rushed outside searching nearby streets and calling their names. Soon, officers expanded the operation across parks, abandoned buildings, drainage systems, and industrial areas throughout Gary. Search dogs were deployed, but difficult terrain, fading scent trails, and the absence of a clear starting direction limited their effectiveness. As the hours passed, the family began confronting a disturbing reality. If King and Diamond had simply wandered away, someone should have noticed them. A small child beside a cognitively impaired adult would normally attract attention in public. Yet no confirmed witness ever emerged, and the absence of sightings slowly became evidence in itself for investigators and relatives alike. In the days following the disappearance, urgency gradually transformed into exhaustion and uncertainty. Public attention shifted toward details inside the home, especially Suzanne falling asleep while supervising the children. The 40-minute gap between 10:20 and 11 a.m. became the emotional center of the investigation, a narrow stretch of time everyone tried desperately to reconstruct without direct proof. Rumors and unverified sightings quickly spread across nearby communities. Some claimed Diamond and King had been seen near fast food restaurants, while others placed them miles away in different cities. None of these accounts could be confirmed. One theory suggested Diamond's vulnerability and obsession with food may have made her especially easy for someone dangerous to manipulate or lure away unnoticed. At the same time, suspicion quietly expanded toward the family itself. Online discussions questioned whether more information had been withheld, although police never publicly identified any relative as a suspect. The combination of grief, media attention, and constant speculation placed enormous psychological pressure on everyone connected to the case, where even silence began to feel suspicious in the eyes of the public watching closely. Weeks later, the investigation took another devastating turn when authorities recovered the body of a young child from a lagoon in Chicago. Because the description resembled King's age and appearance, fear spread quickly through the family. For days they waited in suspended uncertainty, wondering whether the search was ending or transforming into a tragedy far more permanent and emotionally unbearable for them. When forensic testing confirmed the child was not King Walker, relief lasted only moments before another reality settled in. King and Diamond were still missing. No body had been found, no suspect identified, and no evidence explained what happened inside those missing minutes. And with every passing year, The silence surrounding the case only seemed to deepen instead of fading away completely forever. The investigation into King Walker and Diamond Bynum's disappearance began with urgency, but quickly transformed into something more frustrating than chaos. Investigators were not confronted by overwhelming evidence, but by its complete absence. The case became defined by what never appeared, even after massive search efforts spread across Gary and its surrounding abandoned neighborhoods during the critical early stages of investigation. Authorities launched one of the largest search operations Gary had seen in decades. Investigators combed through abandoned homes, industrial zones, drainage systems, and overgrown lots across the city. But the environment itself became an obstacle. Extreme heat, unstable ground, and collapsing structures limited access, transforming many possible evidence sites into dangerous spaces difficult to search completely. Despite these efforts, the investigation never developed a reliable foundation. There were no confirmed footprints, no useful surveillance recordings, and no meaningful cellular data capable of reconstructing movement patterns. Early theories considered whether King and Diamond may have suffered an accident inside an abandoned structure, a plausible concern in a city marked by decay. But even this explanation struggled because no physical evidence was ever recovered anywhere. As time passed, the accident theory gradually weakened. Investigators searched abandoned structures, empty lots, and hazardous buildings throughout Gary, without recovering any physical evidence connected to King or Diamond. No clothing, belongings, or biological traces were ever discovered. The complete absence of material evidence made it increasingly difficult to support the idea that both victims had simply become lost or trapped somewhere unnoticed. As the investigation slowed, public attention grew rapidly. Media coverage emphasized the vulnerability of both King and Diamond, pushing the case far beyond Gary. Online discussion soon turned into scrutiny, with many questioning the family's behavior and decisions. In the absence of answers, speculation expanded quickly, filling investigative gaps with suspicion, assumptions, and emotional interpretation. One recurring criticism focused on the lack of a broader Amber Alert response. Some members of the public believed earlier emergency notification may have increased the chances of locating them quickly. For the family, this period became emotionally exhausting. They searched constantly while also defending themselves against rumors, accusations, and interpretations shaped more by uncertainty than evidence, all while grief and pressure continued growing around them every single day. Community efforts continued despite the absence of progress. Prayer gatherings, neighborhood vigils, and flyer campaigns carried on for years as relatives and volunteers tried to keep public attention alive. At the same time, investigators continued exploring possible suspects and scenarios. One major theory suggested opportunistic abduction, where a stranger may have recognized Diamond and King as vulnerable targets during a brief but critical moment of exposure outside. Because of Diamond's cognitive limitations, investigators considered the possibility that she could have been manipulated through food, assistance, or simple persuasion. Law enforcement reviewed individuals with violent or sexual criminal histories living near the area, yet none could be directly connected to the disappearance. Another theory proposed that both victims accidentally entered a dangerous abandoned structure and became trapped or injured without anyone realizing what had occurred afterward. A final theory centered on familiarity instead of chance. Some investigators questioned whether someone known to the family played a role, suggesting the story of simply wandering away might not explain everything, yet no evidence supported that possibility. No surveillance footage, digital records, or verified witness statements connected any known individual directly to the disappearance. What remains consistent across every theory is the absence of resolution. Each explanation contains logical elements, yet none are supported by physical confirmation or decisive evidence. The investigation continues resisting any movement toward a single, verifiable truth. Every possible narrative eventually collapses into uncertainty, leaving investigators trapped between probability, speculation, and the persistent silence surrounding the disappearance itself after so many years without answers. Beyond the investigation, itself, the case revealed painful realities about cognitive disability and vulnerability. Diamond's limited awareness and impulsive behavior placed her at constant risk, while Gary's abandoned neighborhoods created spaces where unusual movement could go unnoticed. Together, personal vulnerability and environmental neglect formed, conditions where two people could disappear without immediate resistance, witnesses, or intervention. As years passed, online discussions surrounding the case became increasingly polarized. Some theories expanded into extreme claims involving trafficking or intentional concealment within the family, despite lacking evidence. Investigators repeatedly emphasized that while many possibilities exist, none are supported strongly enough to confirm a single narrative. That absence of proof became one of the most defining and psychologically frustrating aspects of the entire investigation. In later years, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children releases age progression, images of King Walker showing how he might appear at ages 8 and 9. These images serve as both investigative tools and emotional anchors for ongoing hope. Despite years of searching, no confirmed sighting has ever led investigators to a real breakthrough. Anonymous tips, reported encounters, and scattered witness claims repeatedly ended in dead ends or unverifiable information. The case remains officially open, yet no suspect has been charged, no decisive evidence uncovered, and no complete reconstruction of events established by authorities after all this time. What remains instead is the familiar pattern of unresolved disappearances, constant activity without resolution, movement without progress, and investigation without closure. Over time, uncertainty became the only permanent element. In cases like this, silence stops feeling empty and begins shaping the entire story itself, because the most disturbing part is often how long no answers ever arrive. The case of King Walker and Diamond Bynum does not end with resolution. Instead, it settles into a quieter and more unsettling state where explanations multiply but certainty never arrives. Over time, the disappearance becomes less about what happened and more about what refuses to be proven. One of the earliest lines of speculation centers on what is known as the internal conflict theory. This suggests that something may have occurred inside the home during that critical window and was later concealed or misunderstood. It is not supported by direct evidence, but it persists due to gaps in the timeline. Supporters of this theory point to the narrow time frame between Suzanne falling asleep and the moment both King and Diamond were reported missing. Within that short interval, no outside witness confirms movement, which leaves room for interpretation and suspicion. However, investigators have never publicly identified any family member as a suspect. There is no formal charge, no confirmed forensic linkage, and no verified testimony that establishes internal wrongdoing. The theory remains circumstantial rather than evidential. From a psychological standpoint, family members are often scrutinized, first in child disappearance cases. This is not necessarily because of guilt, but because they are closest to the last known point of contact and control over the environment where the disappearance occurred. The second and more widely discussed theory involves an opportunistic predator. In this scenario, a stranger takes advantage of a brief moment of vulnerability when Diamond and King are outside or momentarily unobserved. Diamond's cognitive limitations become central to this theory. Her tendency to trust others and respond to basic prompts such as food or assistance could make her particularly vulnerable to manipulation by someone offering help. Gary's physical environment supports the plausibility of concealment. With numerous abandoned homes and low visibility across neighborhoods, the city provides conditions where someone could be moved or hidden without immediate detection. In a scenario involving a vehicle, the time frame becomes even shorter. Some investigators suggest that if an abduction occurred, it could have taken less than a minute, especially if the perpetrator acted with preparation and familiarity with the area. This theory also helps explain the lack of physical evidence. A rapid removal from the scene leaves minimal opportunity for trace evidence, particularly in an environment already compromised by decay and urban fragmentation. When comparing both theories, the contrast becomes psychologically significant. One involves familiarity and potential internal tension. The other involves randomness and external threat. Both are plausible, yet neither is confirmed. This creates a difficult question that remains unanswered, whether the greater fear lies in betrayal from within a trusted environment or in the idea that danger can appear without warning from complete strangers. From a psychological perspective, disappearances involving young children often carry heightened emotional weight because they represent absolute vulnerability. King had no ability to navigate danger or understand distance in any meaningful way. Diamond's situation adds another layer of complexity. Although physically an adult, her cognitive development placed her in a childlike mental state. This combination of age and vulnerability creates a unique risk profile that can be easily misunderstood. In scenarios involving unfamiliar individuals, Diamond may not have been able to accurately assess risk or interpret intention. This makes her highly susceptible in situations where trust is quickly established or exploited. Offender psychology in opportunistic abduction cases often involves rapid assessment. The perpetrator identifies vulnerability, evaluates risk, and acts within a very short window of opportunity, sometimes based on visual cues alone. What is particularly unsettling is the speed at which such decisions can occur. In some cases, a perpetrator may observe a target for only seconds before acting, relying on environmental conditions that reduce the likelihood of interruption. Beyond psychological analysis, the case also invites broader philosophical interpretation. In many cultural perspectives, events like this are seen not only as investigative failures, but as existential disruptions that challenge how people understand safety and randomness. From an Eastern philosophical viewpoint, there is a belief that actions leave traces within a broader moral structure, even when human systems fail to uncover them. This creates a form of enduring hope that truth cannot remain permanently hidden. For the family, this belief often becomes a source of emotional endurance. Memorials, anniversaries, and continued searching are not only acts of remembrance, but also expressions of resistance against silence and forgetting. From a Western perspective, the case reflects the darker side of human nature, where indifference and moral detachment can exist quietly within ordinary communities. A city may contain thousands of people and still fail to protect its most vulnerable residents. That contradiction is what makes certain disappearances remain psychologically unresolved long after public attention disappears. In this case, tragedy may not have begun with violence, but with a moment no one recognized as dangerous until it disappeared forever. More than a decade later, King Walker and Diamond Bynum remain missing without explanation or closure. What remains are age progression images, uncertain witness accounts, and painful memories carried by families still living between hope and despair. Eugene Bynum continues to believe that someone holds knowledge of what happened even if they have never come forward. This belief reflects a common psychological response to unresolved loss, where certainty becomes more important than closure. King's mother continues to live with a question that has no natural resolution. The absence of her child is not only physical, but temporal, frozen in a moment that cannot be revisited or corrected. Over time, the case has become more than an individual investigation. It has become a representation of missing persons cases that fade from public attention without ever reaching conclusion. The longer silence continues, the more powerful the case becomes in memory. Not because of what is known, but because of what will never fully be known. And in that space between knowledge and absence, the story of King Walker and Diamond Bynum remains suspended, unchanged by time but deepened by it. Because some cases do not end with answers. They end with echoes that never stop repeating the same unanswered question.